is the most important thing to them. The first thing they instill in you is that you are the first Black republic.
1804 becomes important because it's the date at which the implementation of the dream of real revolution and real equality and new nation status and the ability to defend your new nation is manifest.
When you look at modern historians, when they talk about victories that Europeans had over non-white people, they always frame the narrative as victories. But when African people rise up and fight off their European oppressors, they frame the narrative as a massacre.
Africans everywhere that were enslaved resisted it. Haiti becomes significant because it was the first time in human history that an enslaved population actually overthrew their oppressors.
The Haitian Revolution, though, was the most organized, the most large-scale, the most impressive in terms of structure and complication from the very beginning.
Haiti made more money for France than all 13 colonies.
The Haitian Revolution was very influential, particularly amongst Africans. It was seen as an inspiration for Africans in this hemisphere, just as it was seen as a horror by those who held slavery dear.
There is a concept that we must defeat Haiti. We must ground them into the ground. We can never let them rise. They are an example of Black power. They are an example of what happens when people who are oppressed decide to stop being oppressed.
The island of Hispaniola is one of the oldest islands in the Western Hemisphere. The island is very strategic because it has a lot of natural resources, it has a lot of precious metals, and a lot of the European powers were scrambling to get control of that area.
Haiti is the first place that Christopher Columbus did a fort, did a settlement. So it's the first settlement in the Americas.
Christopher Columbus on the west coast of Africa in 1482. He's involved with Africans on the West Coast. That is how he came to America in the first place. It was they who told him there was land to the west. In fact, in his journals, he says that he met Africans going back to Africa when he was on his way to America.
What folks are doing these days shows that there were Africans on that island when Columbus got there. At least 3 different types. There were the Caracals up in the north, Guanini, and there's another one. But you can find that in the book called The Annals of Haiti.
The Spanish declared this was for them, but the French says, what do you mean this is for you? And the British said, well, how could you have it all? So right from the beginning, we had colonial wars among them on the island.
When you're dealing with the Spaniards, you're looking at the introduction of Africans in 1503. When you're looking at the introduction of Africans from the French, you're looking at 1670. So you're looking at a wide gap between the Spaniards and the French bringing Africans onto this island. But what happened on that island was that they brought a culture that was deeply steeped in what is probably the most important liberating force that any human can have, and that is in spirituality.
1675, the Treaty of Ryswick, the church established that the island would be split in 2. One side would be for the Spaniards, and the other side would be for the French. So at that point, what the Spaniards had named the island, I told you, was already Haiti. That's the original name of the island. Now, the Spaniards named the island Hispaniola. And when they agreed to share it with French, the French called their side Saint-Domingue, and the Spaniards kept Hispaniola for theirs, but called the capital city Santo Domingo, which is still Saint-Domingue.
When the Spanish got here in 1492, and you know, they are on the island from 1492 to 1625, the Spanish is looking for gold. They're looking for wealth, and this is the first thing they started doing. And they find some gold. Haiti still produces gold today. And so gold was the big prize that everybody's looking for. But once they get into sugarcane was sweet gold. I mean, sugarcane was it.
During the period where they were commencing this genocide against the indigenous population, a priest called Bartholomew de las Casas came up with this idea that it was ungodly to do what they were doing to the indigenous people of Hispaniola. They were killing them off. It was terrible, which it was, incredibly brutal. So they needed someone else to do it to. And this was where he came up with the idea of getting people from elsewhere.
This revolution was going on from the moment Africans touched the shores. That's very important to understand, because what also happened is that when Africans were brought to this island, many of the warriors from the Congo, from Yoruba, or what we call Nigeria, or from Ghana, when they were brought here, the Ashanti, they immediately escaped and created maroon towns. These maroon towns would later become the actual hubs of the revolutions, because many of them never really experienced being enslaved. The great majority of sugar that was consumed in Europe came from that part of the world, came from that island. The coffee that went to Europe came from that island.
That colony that the Spanish founded, taken by the French, eventually became the most profitable colony in the Americas, and arguably, depending on which economist you consult, the most profitable colony in the world at the time. It became the centerpiece of the transatlantic slave system. It became what gave France its supremacy over Britain in the 18th century. I mean, this island, it's impossible to overstate the economic importance of the island in the period we're talking about. It produced more profit than all of North America combined.
This was a wealth that was largely borne by sugar, which was not only an item used to sweeten your tea and coffee, but it was also a marker of class. It was seen as a sign of sophistication when one used sugar. And in certain circles, it was even seen as a miracle drug of some sorts. And that helped to generate tremendous amounts of wealth on the island of Hispaniola, which is one of the reasons why the French, ultimately backed by the United States, fought so fiercely to retain that island.
I mean, the life expectancy in Jamaica or Haiti, for example, was often between 3 and 7 years. So once you arrived on the island, you were worked to death on average between 3 and 7 years. I mean, it's genocide. And so that was what contributed, the type of torture. Because the white population was so much smaller than, say, on mainland America, vis-a-vis the black population, the paranoia was worse. And therefore the types of punishment, the types of torture, the extremity of the slave regime was much more severe in the Caribbean.
Taking pregnant women, crucify them, split their belly open enough so they will have a game. People are gonna bet who's gonna die first, the baby or the mother.
The reason why there was more rebellions in Jamaica and in the Caribbean in general is a number of factors. One, conditions were much worse. And I don't say that in any way to denigrate or downplay how brutal conditions were in America, but we can see this from the fact that the slavery was so bad in the Caribbean that the populations were not even able to reproduce themselves. So constantly new populations had to be brought from Africa.
And one of the things they used to do is bury us alive on an anthill, leaving your head so that you would slowly get tortured to death by ants eating your skull.
First of all, let's be clear, the rebellions against slavery started in Africa. And the rebellions against slavery in Africa are probably the most under-discussed and underrepresented element of the whole history. Everyone tells you that Africans collaborated, which is true. What they don't tell you about is those Africans that rebelled. And in fact, scholars estimate now, that it has been studied thoroughly, that the rebellions in Africa alone, of which there were hundreds, prevented perhaps 1 million people from crossing the Atlantic.
And one of the ways the planters kept control of Haiti was either to rape or have a child with a black woman, and then send that child to Europe to be educated, and then bring them back, and they became the overseers.
But all Africans that were enslaved understood that their natural state of being human was to be free and African. Those two things always went together.
In the Caribbean, because there was a concentration of sugar plantations, which was the most brutal form of slavery, worse than cotton or indigo or coffee or tobacco, it was the most labor-intensive. And also the number of Africans versus the number of Europeans was much higher in the Caribbean. And then you have, of course, terrain. So island like Jamaica, island like Haiti, very mountainous, lend themselves to guerrilla warfare. Then you have strange political coincidences. So like during the years preceding the Haitian Revolution, there was a civil war in Africa in the Congo. So a lot of the Africans, Congolese, that ended up being Maroons in Haiti were African war veterans. They were militarily trained personnel back in Africa.
With the Haitian Revolution, there were 4 principal players in regards to the leadership of the Haitian Revolution. The first one was Mackandal.
Mackandal is considered to be the precursor to the 1791 beginning, because Mackandal was an enslaved African who worked at a plantation, and then he died in 1757 or 1758. But he freed himself, right? Some people say that he had lost one arm in a sugar mill accident. But essentially, the legend of Mackandal is interesting because he foretold what would happen with regards to the Haitian Revolution.
He was this extraordinary herbalist. And what he did, he taught the people of Haiti, the Africans, how to use the herbs and fauna in the ecology that they're now in to poison the food of the white farmers. And he was very successful.
And so Mackandal went, took to the hills, and he would teach the kitchen people how to poison their masters.
They had nature on their side, and that's very important. They used nature as one of their greatest weapons. They knew the terrain, they understood the terrain, they understood botany, they understood toxicology, they understood poisons, they understood, and that's what Voodoo is. Voodoo is a science. Voodoo is not just a spiritual system.
The Bafioti means the black collaborators. They had to get them out of their face first. Mackandal, what he's really known, a lot of what he went after them first. Before he poisoned the European, he poisoned the black collaborators. No, they were all in the house Negroes, come on.
And one thing about Mackandal, he realized this. He understood that the black collaborators, we call them coons today, how they will sabotage black progress in order to get individual trinkets. So Mackandal, he saw that early on. So when it came to poisoning the white supremacists, Mackandal, he understood that we gotta get rid of these collaborators first. So he poisoned many of the black collaborators before he started to poison the white slave owners.
If you look at the statutes, the laws of a place like Georgia in the 1750s, contemporaneous with that revolt on Hispaniola, you'll find laws that are specifically seeking to restrain Africans from getting knowledge of plants because it was feared that they had in mind a plot or a conspiracy similar to what unfolded in what is now Haiti in the 1750s.
See, African people used strategies that they knew would work. Mackandal, another great revolutionary, he poisoned the French. And the women were the ones that poisoned them when they would prepare foods. He killed over 6,000 European Frenchmen.
When the enslaved Africans were finished with their work, he went down to talk to them. Like he would always go down and talk to them. And at one night, he took out 3 handkerchiefs. A yellow handkerchief, a white handkerchief, and a black handkerchief. And he said to the audience, in terms of storytelling, because that's how we give information through stories. So he took out the first handkerchief, and he said to the enslaved Africans, first handkerchief was yellow. He says, these are the people that owned this island before Columbus came. And they were totally annihilated. Then he took out the white. He says, the white handkerchief, these are the folks that, annihilated the Tainos. And then he took out the black handkerchief, and this is the prophecy. He says, we, Africans, are going to avenge the Taino folks, and we're going to get these white folks out of Haiti.
And so Mackandal used his science, and I think he was a kind of pharmacologist in modern terms, but he used his science of understanding the natural world to begin to talk about how do we take that knowledge and free ourselves. And Mackandal, he's sort of the spark of the Haitian Revolution.
When you look at many of the people coming up out of this system, for instance, Mackandal was a preacher. And Mackandal was a preacher who told his people and the people around him that he had visions. There's such a connection between Mackandal and Nat Turner as it relates to the work that they were doing.
Mackandal understood the problem with the collaborators. And unfortunately, it was a black collaborator who turned Mackandal in, who turned on him. And the French captured Mackandal, and they were going to burn him alive. When Mackandal was about to die, he made a very strange prediction. Mackandal said, I'm coming back as a mosquito. Now, a lot of people didn't know what that meant. Years later, when the French came to invade the island, there was a certain number of French troops, thousands of them, who were killed by malaria brought on by mosquitoes. Now, the malaria skipped over the Africans because they were immune to the malaria, but the Mackendall prediction definitely came true. That just showed how spiritually in touch they were.
The next Haitian leader who was instrumental in the Haitian Revolution was a voodoo priest from Jamaica named Duddy Bookman.
So Bookman appears to be one of these persons who's leading resistance in Jamaica. The British, not wanting to martyr him, sells him to the French in Haiti because the French is known for breaking black folk. Jamaica was supposed to be the place where that was done, but the French is supposed to be really strategic at this and good at this.
Bookman is the child of a woman whose name I don't have yet, who was a big-time revolutionary in Jamaica. And her son was sold to Saint-Domingue as punishment to the mother. So he was about 13, 14 when he was sold over here. And they seem to have been Muslims. He talks a lot about the Quran. And in fact, he's named Bookman because he had a small Quran tied to his waist. And at some point they realized that. And when he refused to give it to the colonizers and slavers, they burnt the book on him, with him. So he was all burnt up. And then to mock him, named him Bookman.
Bookman and another enslaved African woman named Cecilia Fatima began the planning stages of the revolution. They went around the island and they organized a Congress to participate in the infamous Bois Cayman voodoo ceremony that occurred in an alligator swamp.
Cecile Fatima had gone around for about 4 years to bring that Congress together. She had gone around the whole entire island to bring that Congress together.
And as much as many people talk about that meeting in the alligator swamp, that Bookman called for the prayer, but it wasn't Bookman that called that congregation together. And it wasn't done in an instant. It was months of organizing and building up. And the person who was leading this organization was a mambo, a female priestess by the name of Cecilia Fatima.
It should not be seen as surprising that some of the leading figures of the revolutionary process were said to be either believers or practitioners of this New World belief system that we refer to as Vodun or voodoo.
I like to share with my students. Think about what mastery you must have if you decide to hold your meeting in a swamp of alligators.
This kind of going so far as to take the life of your oppressor is already there. And the place where that meeting took place, the alligator swamp, that was a place the whites didn't go in because there were really alligators up in there. So very few people could go in there and come out. But the black folks had a different relationship with the ecology than whites had. They mastered having this relationship. The whole concept of the Yoruba religion is to know and understand the forces of nature.
When you're trying to get free, it's very important to create your own identity. When you want to oppress somebody, the thing you do, you change their name, you change their religion, you change their language. And the Haitians understood that they needed their own language. This is why they speak the French Creole. That's a form of their own language. They knew that they had to go back to their own religion. They went back to voodoo. And there were people who were Catholic, there were people who were Christian, there were people who were different religions, but they went back to voodoo, and that codified everybody.
It was an African spiritual force that brought the people together. And when African people were brought together, it gave them a common goal. When they had a common goal, then they knew the common enemy, and then they would take care of their own business.
And voodoo is not just a religion. I mean, Africans didn't really have religions. They had a way of life that at best you can call their sacred science in dealing with cosmology and ecology.
Intentionality was to make our stuff so fearful and so evil and so scary that we run away from it. you know. And so all you gotta say is that, you know, when I was growing up, if I met a young lady and I asked her where she's from, she said she's from Louisiana, I'd be backing out. Oh, she might know voodoo. You know, she gonna put something in my soup. She gonna do some people. See, that just make us afraid of our own stuff.
We ain't talking about no Dracula movies here, no zombies. We're basically talking about Africanism. We're talking about people that understand the strengths of plants and of nature and how to, you know, outwitty a militia by using what the gods have provided you on this earth.
So you call upon lowers to meet the task that you're confronted with. If you're engaging in war, you would call upon a lower that has the characters and qualities and dispositions of being warlike or strong and strength and fearless.
Dying was an opportunity to go back to the ancestors, to Guinea, right? So there was no fear.
Through science and through faith and through the will of not fearing death. Most Haitians don't fear death. They don't.
A lot of Haitians, they say don't fear death. So when you look at a lot of rappers now, a lot of rappers here in America, they will have Haitian gangsters in their entourages. And a lot of these dudes will have that Haitian muscle behind them. So this just shows the kind of respect and even fear that a lot of people still have for that Haitian rebel.
I mean, imagine if you're not scared of death, you're not going to be a good slave. And this is one of the reasons Christianity preached that suicide is a sin. Yeah? One of the reasons that you get your reward in the afterlife, but only if you're a good slave.
It really is a science of the spirit. And that this voodoo that they demonized, the demonization of it was intentional because they wanted to separate us from the very thing that gave us power.
Let's be clear, a lot of African spiritual systems believed in what we call the transmigration of the soul. So they believe that the soul is eternal. This was very problematic for people you want to enslave. Again, coming back to before we even get to Haiti, in Africa itself, there are copious records among Europeans writing about slavery of Africans just jumping in the sea. I'd rather dead than be a slave. Consistent. And particular groups, so the Igbo of Nigeria, who are a group that very much believed in the transmigration of the soul, they were one of the groups that is recorded by Europeans were most likely to commit suicide because they believed they'd be reborn in Africa. They believed that their soul lived forever, so I'd rather die than this stuff.
There is a cultural, spiritual unity that unites Africans and it gives them power. Even today, in the African-American community, it is the church that is the most powerful. And when anybody wants to sway the people, they always bring pastors in because they understand the pastors have the ear of the congregation and the people in the community.
We don't know shocking when you said rise of the dead when we talk about Jesus Christ. You know, if they say they can have Jesus rising, we can have my mama rising.
I had a heart attack some years ago, but 7 years ago, something called ventricular tachycardia. Heart beating too fast, it won't stop because I'm always doing stuff, you know. And they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. So finally they came one morning and said, Mr. Small, we're gonna bring in the electricians. So I said, you know, y'all full of joke. He said, oh no, we're gonna bring in the electricians. Because they have doctors who are human electricians. And their job is to measure the electrical current that goes from your brain to your heart and to your other organs, and to look at the relationship to the electrical current in your body and how much is it being interfered with from things outside of your body. Does that sound like voodoo to you? So that's what voodoo is talking about. And while on one hand we deny it when we talk about voodoo, but here in our highest science, it is proven to be reality.
So the Africans had absolutely no fear because they knew that this was a transformation, that it is how you live that matters, not how you die.
The concept of zombies comes from voodoo. It's an African concept. And it's not about the living dead, it's about worshiping the ancestors, praising the ancestors. But the white supremacists, they flip that into something demonic where people are going to come out the ground and walk around and get you. And that's that boogeyman concept that they've created because of the Haitians rising up and getting revenge. And that's always been a scary thing for the white supremacists, African people rising up, getting revenge on them. That's the zombie mentality that they've created because that's their fear. When you look at the old zombie movies back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, they would actually use Africans and Haitians as zombies.
And out of their West Indian island comes a tale of terror and voodoo, of witchcraft and zombies, and all the weird black magic that the white man seldom sees.
All of those old zombie movies had voodoo themes, so they were very open about it then.
You see, the thing about Dutty Boukman was he was so intelligent, he knew that he might not get it, because he did get captured and he was executed. But the revolution continued with the people. And that's another lesson I learned about the Haitian Revolution. It wasn't so much the leaders, it was the people. The people never gave up the spirit. To this very day, they still have the spirit.
Boukman is known for 3 or 4 things. Number 1 is the Boukman's prayer. You know, the God who created the earth, who created the sun that gives us light, the God that watches us from the clouds, the God that holds up the ocean. Our God has seen what the white man has done to us. Our God wants us to do good. The God of the white man wants him to do crimes. It's our God who will give us the strength and the courage to beat this white man.
So now this is the man who's going to rise from this. This thing is going to rise and say to us on August 14, 1791, the God who created the world, who make the waves move in the ocean, he is your Father. He is with you and will give you his strength. But you must act and free yourself.
Dutty Boukman is very intelligent. He is one of the leaders of the African people. He's very respected. And what he's going to do is he's going to devise a plan. And he is going to incorporate the ceremony of Ogun, the god of war. And he is going to assemble the forces. And he is going to instill in them a spirit of revolution.
And the last sentence is a pretty long thing. In the last sentence, he says, listen to the voice of freedom. It speaks in each one of your hearts. When they ask him, but who will lead us in this battle? He says, the leader is inside you. You are the general, and you are the soldier. Now get to it.
He comes from the form of just total understanding of what war is. There is no conceptual framework of peace. You don't call on Ogun for peace. You don't call on him for negotiation. You call on him when everything has been done that you've tried to do. You've been as diplomatic as you possibly can. But now it's time to get busy.
I have not seen anywhere where there's some text in voodoo that says, forgive and forget.
Black people and African people globally, we have this Jedi mind trick that's ran on us by the white supremacists where they can mistreat, subjugate, maldistribute the resources, harm, and oppress, and then tell us we should forgive them because this passage in the Bible says so. And that's a trick that African people have been falling for a long time. And the Haitian people, they didn't fall for that. They went to their old spiritual system. They went to African spiritual systems. They went to the voodoo. And in voodoo, there is no concept of forgiveness. And that's the thing that scared the white supremacists. And we got to stop falling for their mind tricks when they harm and oppress us and then tell us to forgive them. We got to start thinking in terms of our African spiritual systems and in terms of survival.
So we meet in those different places in the forest. And one question has to be debated. What can we do so our children and our grandchildren do not have to suffer what we're suffering here? And this is the night the decision was taken. There is no two ways. This man only understands force. So only with force can we talk back to him. And some people started saying, well, but we don't have boats, we don't have guns, we don't have this, we don't have that. And one of the answers that was given is God has never created a creature and not give you a way to fight. You sit on a stone, it is a tool while it's holding your body. But when you are attacked, you have your weapon under your butt. Use it.
When it comes to guerrilla warfare, and this is what the Haitian Revolution is a lesson in, We have to understand how guerrilla warfare works. When you're going up against a superpower, you can't go head up. You have to attack the flanks. You have to attack from the back. And you have to learn how to weaponize everything. So the Haitians, they learned how to weaponize nature, weaponize rocks, weaponize trees, weaponize animals. Understand that, because when they had the first voodoo ceremony, they had that in an alligator swamp. Now, they knew that the white supremacists weren't going to no alligator swamp, but they were just so in touch with nature, they knew they needed to weaponize everything.
Once you get to the point where you're going to do this, what you're actually doing is you are bringing the God of war within you. And every one of us as human beings has the God of war in us. We many times tried to keep it down.
The War Council was August 14th. They decided the revolution would start a week from there. A lot of those Africans did not speak the same language. They all came from different spaces, and a lot of them didn't know how to count. When would the revolution? So each were given, this is another, I do this also, each were given 7 stones, everybody at Boacaima. And then they went back to their spaces, the plantation. Every morning, they were supposed to let one go. When there was no more stones in your hand, then kupetet bulikai, burn it all down.
Pat Robertson said that the devil was conjured up by the Haitians, and they had a devil-worshiping ceremony, and the devil killed all the French and killed all the whites on the island, which is a lie, by the way. They did not kill all the white people on the island. That's another big propaganda lie that they like to promote.
Something happened a long time ago in Haiti, and people might not want to talk about it. They were under the heel of the French. You know, Napoleon III and whatever. And they got together and swore a pact to the devil. They said, we will serve you if you'll get us free from the French. It's a true story. And so the devil said, okay, it's a deal. And they kicked the French out. You know, the Haitians revolted and got themselves free. But ever since, they have been cursed by one thing after the other, desperately poor.
Pat Robertson said that Satan came up, killed all the white people, and the Haitians have been cursed ever since. And that just shows how racially insecure do you have to be. You would rather give props to Satan. You would rather give credit to Satan than a group of African people who really put in the work and got rid of the French.
The night originally chosen to start the Haitian Revolution, so we remember the Haitian Revolution, August the 22nd, August the 23rd, right? The original plan was to start on the 24th. The reason the 24th was chosen was because on the 25th, the entire government was meeting the next day. So the ambition from the beginning was to kill the entire government and take over the island. The only reason the revolution had to start earlier, the rebellion had to start earlier, was because on the 21st, somebody struck early. And slave masters captured someone, tortured someone, and were warned that there was a rebellion coming. So they decided to strike early.
It's like asking the question, how did the Vietnamese defeat the reigning superpower of the United States of America? And part of that answer rests with the question of guerrilla warfare. That is to say, trying to avoid, whenever necessary, face-to-face confrontations of one military brigade facing another military brigade, but harassing the invading forces, who after all oftentimes are not very familiar with the geography.
So there was a dinner that happened a week before the Boacaima ceremony, and actually it's now, scholars say, that's where the rebellion was planned. So it wasn't like they planned it on the spur of the moment on the night of the 22nd. The main leaders sat down and planned a week before, maybe months before that, had their dinner. The crazy part about it is that the Europeans knew that their privileged slaves were meeting for dinner, and they didn't think anything of it. They were so utterly convinced that black people were never going to do anything about their situation, could never overthrow them. They could never be defeated by a bunch of lazy, backwards niggers from Africa, that they got complacent.
How to be able to create bamboo, knives, how to have blow darts. You know, all of these things they used against these forces because these forces could not fight a guerrilla-type warfare.
So with the martial arts and the idea of the fighting, whether if we're talking about Brazil, capoeira, or the motions of if we go to a voodoo ceremony and you see how they work with spears in different ways, or we go to the Amazons and you see how it's applied, it's the philosophy, the genesis of it all is a form of worship where even if the slave master comes, it more looks like it's a celebration of parties and different things going on, so it's not intimidating. But at the same time, it forms a form of martial arts, a form of self-defense, where when it's time to rise for the revolution, the master